Hi, welcome to my channel, Kayla Creations. I'm going to show you how I created these albums today. They have a soft spine with a floating hinge. This is a technique that I've seen on various YouTube tutorials. I've kind of taken a little bit here and a little bit there from the different tutorials and come up with how I needed to make my albums. So I will be showing you a few different things. Each album here is made with the same method, but just a little bit different technique in the way the spine is wrapped and then the materials that are used. So I'll show you this one so you can see the spine. It's a little bit smaller and easier to show you. So you can see the flexibility in the spine here. It has a floating hinge, so the hinge is not attached to the spine. It's all attached together with the spine wrapping around the covers. This album is made only using cardstock pages and hinges. There's no chipboard. So this is the actual cardstock that I've used. It's not super thick or super heavy. I'm not sure the weight exactly, but you can see it's not super heavy. But once I put the design paper onto each side of the page, it creates quite a stiff page. So there's no wobbling here of the pages, and it holds lighter weight embellishments just fine. So I've got some flower clusters here and some chipboard, and so nothing super heavy, and it just makes a really nice weight album. Now this album is a little bit different story. It's larger, so it's going to hold a lot more embellishments, a lot larger chipboard pieces, and just more things. I've also used quite a few metal pieces in the album, so I needed sturdier pages. So I've used lightweight chipboard for my pages, and then I wanted my covers extra sturdy, so I used a medium weight chipboard for the covers. So you can kind of mix and match the materials that you use. For example, you want to do an album with the lightweight pages with just paper, but maybe you want to do some gesso or painting on the covers, and so you need something sturdier. So you could use a medium weight chipboard for the cover. So a little bit of versatility there. The spine on this one is made with fabric, and it also wraps underneath the covers instead of over the covers. So I'll be showing you how to do that. And you see stitching here, but nothing is stitched together. This is just what I call faux stitching. I haven't stitched anything together. I just did the stitching on the fabric here and then glued everything together. So no sewing involved in creating these albums. So I want to talk a little bit about how to determine the size and the depth and how many pages in your album for those of you who are beginners. So if you're an experienced album maker, you might want to fast forward this part a little bit, or maybe just bear with me, and I will try to be brief. There's two different approaches with these albums, and so I'll start with this one. This one, I already had the size determined for me, and that's because I had created a stand to put the album in, and so this could not be any bigger than the stand. In fact, it needed to be a little bit smaller so that I'd have room to pull it in and out of the stand. So I knew I needed to have a 5-inch width, and I didn't want it to be too tall for the stand, so I wanted to make it 7 inches high. And then the depth of the stand had to be, the spine had to be 2 inches. So how many pages can you put in a 2-inch spine? Well, that depends on how many gussets that you, or that depends on how deep your gussets are in your album. So I have a little bit of bulk, even though it's not heavy. I have these flower clusters here with these roses that stand up a bit. The chipboard, I have knots of fabric here. So I knew I needed 1/2 inch gussets. So you just got to do a little bit of math, nothing too complicated. So you can take 2 and divide it by 1/2, and so then you know that you need 4 gussets or 4 hinge pieces. So let me show you this again. So I have my hinge pieces here. Here's the gusset. So I knew for this album I would need 4 of those. Or you could just simply add till you get to 2. So 1/2 inch, 1 inch, 1.5, 2. So 4 hinge pieces. So you need 1 extra page for every hinge piece that you use. So you see here I've got 2 hinge pieces, so there's 3 pages. So this album, 4 hinge pieces, 5 pages. If you have 6 hinge pieces, you need 7 pages. So this album here, I did not need to have a certain hinge, or excuse me, a certain width in the spine or anything like that. The only thing that I was limited to was the embellishments that I wanted to put in the album. And I had quite large items that I wanted to include in the album. So I knew I needed to have a larger album, but just how large depended on the design of my covers. So what I did first is I designed the cover. I knew I wanted these embellishments here. I knew I wanted this title and some flowers and such. So once I designed my cover, I knew I needed 8.5 by 10 inches. Then the pages on this one are a little bit smaller because I wanted all these trims and stuff to hang off the edge of the pages, but I still wanted it contained in the album. I debated on having the lace and stuff stick out of the covers, which would have been fine, but I decided against it, and so I made my pages 8 by 10, so a half inch smaller than the covers. Then once I knew the size of my pages, then I was able to kind of roughly sketch out or design my pages with all the papers and ephemera that I had. Some of the things I actually cut out. I just never attached anything or glued anything on. Just maybe kind of had all my ephemera pieces laid out for each particular page. So once I had finished designing, I had 6 layouts or 6 left and right pages. And so I knew I needed 6 hinge pieces with 7 pages to create my album. So then I created my album, and then I was able to determine the size of the spine and then to wrap that around and top it with my covers. So we'll get into a little bit more of that as we go along in the tutorial. So anyway, so then we'll get started. So this will be a 2-part tutorial in one video. So the first part of the video, I'll be showing you how to create a spine that wraps around on the outside of the covers. So if you're following along, you will need 5 pieces of medium weight chipboard cut to 6 by 6. Now this chipboard just happens to be white on one side, but it really does not matter. All of the chipboard will be covered up. So that is for that album. And then this one with the spine wrapped underneath the covers, I'm going to be using these chipboard scraps that I have from previous albums, and they are 4 inches wide. So I think I'm going to make a tiny 4 by 4 album. So you will need 4 pieces of chipboard, that medium weight chipboard, that are 4 by 4 inches, and 2 of those will be for the pages and 2 for the covers. But for the outer 2 pages, you will need to cut 2 pieces of cardstock that matches the cardstock that you use on your hinges, and you need to cut those at 4 by 4 also. So the outer pages will be cardstock and the inner pages will be chipboard, and then you will have 2 separate pieces that will be used for the covers that will be put on at the very last. So if you're following along with me, that's what you need to cut so far. As we go along, I will tell you how to cut your hinges. All right, so now that you have your 5 pages cut to size, you're going to need 4 hinge pieces. So your hinge pieces will need to be as tall as your pages, which if you're following along with me, that will be 6 inches tall. The width will depend on the width of the gussets, and so I'm going to do 1/2 inch gussets just as I did the previous albums that I showed you. So the sides of the gusset where the hinges where I'm going to attach the pages is also going to be a 1/2 inch. So my hinge pieces will be 1.5 inches wide by 6 inches tall. All right, so now I'm just going to show you how I score the hinges. This is, I don't want to skip anything for the beginners out there. I know how overwhelmed I was when I very first started making albums, and there was just so many ideas to remember. So I'm just scoring at 1/2 of an inch and 1 inch, and that creates the 3 1/2 inch sections that I'm going to be using to attach my pages. And it's really important that I have a nice crisp fold line. So I'm going to burnish all those folded edges there. Um, our pages will line up straighter if we have a nice crisp score line. So I'm just showing you how the hinge is shaped like a U. And so just for reference, as I'm describing how to attach the pages, that inner part of the U is going to be your gusset side right there. And then you flip it over and that's your spine side of your hinge. Okay, so now I'm going to angle the sides of my hinge pieces. So I'm cutting about 1/16 of an inch away from that score line. I don't want to cut right up to the score line because sometimes I might nick it too far. So I think 1/16 of an inch away is really good. So I'm going to angle all my hinge pieces, and then we won't have that um, bulkiness showing or maybe showing on the edge of our pages. So once I've trimmed those angles, then I'm going to um, attach my pages to the hinges. All right, so when we're attaching our pages to the hinge, we want to make sure that they are on the spine side and not the gusset side. So I'm just showing you the spine side there, and so I'm going to take one edge and fold it over and put my glue on the spine side of the hinge. And my pages are 6 by 6, so it really doesn't matter which side I put my hinge on at this point. So I'm just folding that, I'm keeping that hinge folded where I've got the glue, and then I'm also just lining those two edges up together and just making sure it's nice and straight. Then I'm going to open that up and burnish that inside edge there to the chipboard. So the second page, I'm going to do it a little bit different. It's just easier for me to line everything up correctly. So I'm going to put the gusset side down and put glue on the opposite edge of my hinge. And then I'm just going to line that second page up to that score line. So the gusset side is face down on the table. And then I'm just going to take my page and line it up to that score line. Now it's really important that you don't go too far in to the score line. If you go in too much, your pages won't fold open correctly, and they also won't fold in correctly. So it's really important that you just line everything up just next to that score line and not over it or not touching it. I'm just burnishing that down there. I'm going to flip it over and burnish it again. And then also you want to make sure that your pages are straight. I might be adjusting something there, I'm not really sure, but it's just important that your pages are straight onto the hinge as well. So if you have one side of the a page that's farther away from that score line than the other, your book could be a little crooked. So you want your pages to be straight as well. So again, we're going to put our glue on the spine side of the hinge. So I'm going to pick an edge there, fold it down, and put the glue on. And then this time, since I've already got 2 pages attached, it's going to be much easier if I just make sure that that edge of that page is just folded down. So I'm just showing you there how I folded it flat there. It's just easier to line up that second hinge onto the second page. So okay, so I've got it on there, and I'm just going to press down on that and burnish that, and then I'm going to go ahead and flip it over so that the gusset side is down on the table. And it doesn't really matter which side of the chipboard is facing up or down, the whole thing is going to be covered. The pages will be completely covered, and my hinge, the sides of my hinges will be completely covered. The only thing that will be exposed when we're finished will be the gussets inside the album, and even those I'm going to be covering with design paper. So I'm just lining that up there, and then as we continue on, I'm going to go ahead and fast forward until I have completed putting all the pages onto the hinge pieces. So our last page is on, and so we have one more thing to consider, and that is if we would like the design paper to be offset from the page. Typically, I don't do that on this style of album. I've always just completely covered my page and the hinge with design paper. But there is a way to do it. It just takes a little extra time and a little extra paper. But what I would do is cover the page with a piece of cardstock that matches the hinge, just making sure that it's lining up and not going over the score line, and that it's not sticking out from the edges of my page. And then I can put my design paper and offset it either an eighth or a quarter of an inch, whatever I like. So now our album is complete, and there you have it. We have our 5-page 6x6 album. One important thing that I forgot to mention earlier, and that is that page thickness really does make a difference in the width of your spine or the depth of your album. So if you remember, I said that I needed a 2-inch spine to fit in my stand. Well, this actually ended up being 2 1/8 of an inch. So I'm glad I didn't have to measure that exactly. 2 inches was a good round out number for what I needed. Um, but the reason that it's 2 1/8 of an inch instead of 2 inches is a couple of reasons. The first is that every time I glued a cardstock page onto the hinge, I was doubling that thickness, and I did that 5 times because I had 5 pages. Then also this lace wrapped around the spine added to the thickness. So all in all, 2 1/8 of an inch instead of just 2 inches. Not a big deal. It fits perfectly in my stand. Um, but if I had tried to create the pages out of a lightweight or a medium chipboard, it would have never fit. And you can see the difference here. Same size of gussets, same amount of pages. This one is 1/4 of an inch wider than this one. I did use medium weight chipboard and they are 1/16 of an inch thick. So that's the difference in the size. So just very important to consider when you're determining the size of your album. So first we're going to be making a spine that wraps around on the outside of the covers like this here. But first we need to make a piece that covers our hinges. And so you can use either a piece of design paper like I have here, or you can use the same cardstock that you used to make your hinge pieces. You don't want anything thicker than that because that will defeat the purpose of having a flexible hinge. And don't feel bad if you're not using design paper. It's just going to be peeking out here a little bit. So if you use the cardstock, that's just fine. For the height, you want a piece that is the same height as your album. And then for the width, you're going to measure from inside cover to inside cover, which your covers are the first and last pages. So you don't want it to go all the way across. If it does, it's going to impede the ability to fold your book open, and when you do, it might bend in or dig into that paper there, and it will not fold properly. So it's best to go inside of this fold line on this gusset to inside this fold line on this gusset. So if your gussets are peeking out a little bit from the paper, that's a-okay. In fact, that's a good thing. So you don't want it to be any wider than maybe about there. Okay. Also, I have put a piece of Tyvek on the back to show you where you would place that. You really don't need it on an album this small. I did not use any Tyvek on this album, but for something like the Alice in Wonderland album that's large and heavy, you will need something maybe to strengthen your hinge and your spine. So I did use that. If you're not familiar with Tyvek, it's these mailing envelope material. I've never actually used these to mail anything in. I use it for crafting, but it's really strong. It will not rip. And so I get that at my local office supply store or online. You will need to use a double-sided tape for the Tyvek because liquid adhesive doesn't seem to work too well with it. And then, so I've got mine taped onto the back of my paper, and then to adhere it to the hinges here, I'm going to be placing my tape horizontally like this across. I think it's just going to be better than to have the tape go the same length as the gusset. So I think it's going to be better to put the tape this way. So I'm going to go ahead and get my paper on to my hinge, and then I will be right back. So I have my paper onto my hinge, and I did end up putting a little bit of adhesive glue on top of the tape just to keep it down really good. It kept wanting to pop up on the sides here. So I've got my space in between my covers and my paper. You can see I cut the paper a little crooked here. I've got a little bit of extra showing there. It's going to be fine. Once the spine's on, you won't even notice that. So the next step will depend on which type of material that you use for your spine, such as paper, craft hex, leather. It would take me too long to go through all these options, so I'm going to show you how to create your spine using fabric or lace. So I'm going to be using paper and fabric for my spine. You could very well just use fabric. It would make a very loose and floppy spine. which is actually a-okay for something like maybe a junk journal or just a really junky loose album. But with a chipboard album, I really want that stiffer spine. I want to be able to attach a dangle to there and not have the spine droop down. So, but if you were to just use fabric, you would maybe mark where you want the glue to go on your fabric and then mark where you want that lined up on your album. And you're just gluing the sides of the fabric down, not the center. The spine is not attached to the hinges. Remember, it's a floating spine. So you're only gluing the edges of your fabric. So you can see here that I've stitched my fabric. That's just a faux stitching. I am not attaching anything with that sewing. It's just for decorative purposes only. I do want my edges to fray, and so I just want them to fray naturally. So the fabric is going to overlap the album top and bottom a little bit. So I'm going to be using that piece of paper as the center of my spine. It's just going to give it a little more strength and stability to hold my dangles. And plus, the fabric really is a one-sided fabric. I know it's you could get away with it being double-sided with that denim fabric, but it's not. Um, so to cut our paper, we're going to need it the height of the album and then the full width of that spine. Now my spine is 2 3/8 of an inch wide, and but I just cut it a little bit, a little strip off of that. I didn't want it hanging over those corners of the album. I just think that it would be better not to have it hang over. So I just cut a little bit less than 2 3/8. Now you can also do a lace, and anyway, you're going to glue the paper on the center of the fabric there, but you can also do this with lace. So you can see my paper in the center there of the lace. Excuse me. So it does matter what type of paper that you have. If you're doing lace, you probably want to do a design paper. Um, it will depend which direction the paper goes because of the lace showing through. Um, But before we cut the paper for either the fabric or the lace, we need to train it to bend. So what I'm doing is I'm just scoring at every groove line or every 1/8 of an inch all the way across the paper. And that will just help us to curve it better without folding it. It'll curve it and train the paper which way we want it to go. I usually bend into the ridge side of the score line. Excuse me. So so now that we've so now you can see here that usually most lace has transparent places where you can see through to the paper. So you just want to make sure that your paper is directional. And I'm going to put my glue, or I'm going to show you where I put my glue on my autumn album. I just put the glue on the flowers there. I just used the art glitter glue. I didn't need much glue. And so I just went ahead and used the art glitter glue. Um, So you're not gluing the sides, you're only gluing the flowers that are going to hit that paper. Once the paper is glued onto your paper onto your lace, then you can put the glue onto the edges of that lace and glue it onto your album. And but so anyway, you wait to do those edges there, and I just went underneath the flowers, underneath that tip or that edge of the lace where it was kind of opaque. And then for the top and bottom, I just ran a real thin line of glue, top and bottom, made sure my lace was cut very, very straight. And then I just glued the top and bottom down there so that it would not lift up. I did not want my lace to start fraying. You might want to use some kind of a fray check or something like that. Just test it on your lace first before you do that. So anyway, that's how you would do a lace spine. It's the exact same way that you would do with the fabric, except I'm just going to be just gluing that paper all the way down the center there. So, um, and so again, I'm reiterating that if you just do the fabric, your spine might droop there down the center if you have a heavy dangle. Also, this is the time where you want to, if you're going to use anything like a Tim Holtz fastener that's something with a brad, you want to poke your hole in your into your fabric where you want your hole, then put your brad on and then glue the paper on top of that fabric with the brad poked through, okay? If you're just poking a hole, then wait till you get both your fabric and your paper glued together. So I'm just going to measure the center of my fabric. I'm looking for a pen here. Um, so my fabric was approximately 4 3/8 wide. And so I'm just going to mark about a little over 2 1/4 on each side there. So, and then I'm just going to eyeball the fabric or excuse me, the paper. And now which if you want a certain side of the paper to be peeking through, then you want to make sure which side you're gluing down. It doesn't show much, but it does peek through a little bit. So you wouldn't even have to use design paper if you don't have any scraps to spare. It's a-okay to use the cardstock. It's not going to show much. And you're just going to be gluing the fabric onto the album on the sides of the fabric there. So I'm going to go ahead and glue my paper onto the fabric and I will be right back. All right, so if you're just punching a hole through your paper and your fabric, this is the time to do that. I usually wait to put my dangle on, but if you feel like it's a dangle that you won't be able to attach once you get your spine onto your album, then you need to go ahead and put your dangle on right here or right now. So I usually put it on about an inch down from the top of my spine, but that's just personal preference. So anyway, that's the time to do that now. If you've already done the Tim Holtz fastener, it's already on there, and then you could just attach your dangle on after. Also, this is the time to decide if you want a ribbon closure that wraps underneath your design paper. So um, I'm just looking for some ribbon here to show you. I usually just use a double-sided tape like score tape, and I go about 2/3 or 3/4 up from the center or from the bottom. I don't like it in the center because I like my bows tails to dangle down, and so I usually go up higher than that. Um, and I just use double-sided tape. I give myself plenty of ribbon to tie a bow and to have the tails dangle down. I never know how wide or how full I want the bow to be until I've actually tied it onto the album. And so I always give myself a little extra ribbon. I do have a little bit of waste, but I keep those little snippets for junk journals and stuff like that. So you're going to do the same thing on the back. Just make sure that your ribbons are evened up back to front, and then you're just going to tape those on, add your design papers, and you're good to go. So I'm not going to be using a ribbon closure on my album. I think I'm going to, if I use a closure at all, I'm going to do something else. So I'm going to go ahead and put my design papers on. So here's the time that you need to distress your edges if you want to with maybe scissors if you want that shabby look, or maybe you just want to use ink. That's the time to do that now, and then go ahead and glue your covers on now before we put on the spine. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I'll be right back. I now have my design papers onto my covers. I'm using the Maja Denim and Girls, and I have taken a sander and sanded the edges down just to make sure they're smooth and the paper won't lift up off the chipboard. And then I have re-inked the edges, so I want a little bit of a grungy look. You can see I have some pages peeking down on that bottom right corner. That's probably because I didn't quite get all of my hinges and my pages even top and bottom. It's easy to get the individual page onto the hinge even, but to get all four of them lined up correctly sometimes can be a little bit tricky. So just make sure that you're paying attention and lining those up evenly as you go along. Once I get my spine onto the cover, I think that will alleviate some of the problem. The spine will hold that album cover in place so that it's not sticking up higher than the pages underneath. So now is the time to put the hole in the spine if you want a dangle there. And I've done mine about a little over half an inch from the top, and then I put an eyelet in there. And so also this is the time to decide if you want to put your dangles in now. If you're doing just a jewelry or a chain dangle, I recommend that you do that now before you glue your spine onto your album. Uh, it's just easier to work with that and instead of trying to get it on in between that little space once it's glued on. I usually do a ribbon dangle, so it's easy for me to string that ribbon through that space in between the spine and the hinges. So I'm just going to go ahead and do mine after. So we're going to just glue one side for now, and so I'm not going to put glue all the way to the top and the bottom of the fabric because I want that fabric to be peeking out over the covers, and I also want the fabric to keep fraying on the edge there. So it's important to line up that edge of the paper to that fold of the album there, or that corner of the album. So I'm making sure that paper's lined up and that my fabric is going to be even top and bottom. And so you can see I'm lining up that paper edge there to that corner of the album. And I do apologize if I get out of frame here and there. My chair is a little too short for this table, and I have a temporary setup, and I don't have a table high enough to be able to stand and video. So I'm having to pull that album closer to me to make sure that everything's lined up correctly. So the sides of the fabric there also need to be straightened out. The fabric is just a little bit stretchy, and so I'm having to make sure it's pulled even. But before I really make sure it's burnished down, I want to make sure the other side of that paper is lined up with the other side of the corner of the album so that everything's even and straight. And so I'm seeing that it is, so I'm going to go ahead and continue to straighten that fabric and burnish that side down. I'm using the Crafter's Pick, the Ultimate Glue. I really enjoy this glue. It's kind of like a tacky glue, but it gives me enough wiggle room to have time to move things around before it completely dries. So now we're going to put the glue on the other side, making sure that no glue is on that paper in the middle. That, that paper needs to be detached from the hinge, so no glue there. And so once I've got all my glue on, I'm just going to make sure that the edge of that paper is lined up with the corner of the album and that the spine is going on straight, that I don't have it pulled more to the bottom or the top, and that everything's going to be even top and bottom. I don't want my spine to be on there crooked. So again, the fabric's a little bit stretchy, so I'm just making sure that it's pulled even and that the fabric is even top and bottom, and that that paper edge is correctly lined up with the corner of the album. So I have a little bit of a bubble there in the fabric. It's going to be okay. There's nothing I can do about it now. But if you are worried about bubbles, or if you have a thinner fabric and you don't want to see the ridges of the glue, my suggestion is once you get the glue on the fabric that you take an old paintbrush and smooth that glue down all over the fabric. And so that everything will be nice and smooth and even. So I have a few of the top and bottom edges that are sticking out more in places, and so I'm going to go ahead and trim those even. I'm not going to be cutting all the way to the edge of the album because I still want that frayed fabric to be peeking over the covers. I'm just trimming it a little more even. So once I've done that, that completes this part of the tutorial. So keep watching and I will be showing you how to do the spine like I did on the Alice in Wonderland album with the spine wrapped underneath the covers. So keep watching for that part of the tutorial. All right, so this album, I'm going to do the spine as I did on the Alice in Wonderland album. So I've made the album just as I have done in the previous tutorial. I've made the pages out of chipboard except the front and back page. I have put cardstock instead of chipboard, and that's because I'm going to be placing the covers over the spine once I wrap it around, and I just didn't want a double thickness on my covers. And so I've just used cardstock. I know it's hard to tell because it looks the same color as chipboard, but it's actually just that craft paper that I used on the hinges. I just think it will give less bulk and be more uniform on the book if I use the cardstock there and then place the chipboard on top once I get the spine wrapped around. I've also already decorated my pages. I don't necessarily recommend you do that. I mean, you can get away with it with a smaller album, but it's much easier to build your album, do your spine, and then decorate your pages when you're finished. All right, so now I will show you how to create the fabric spine. So we are going to cover our hinges just as we did on the previous album. And so you're going to need to cut a piece of paper that is the same height as the album, and the width will be a little bit less than the width of the spine, so a little bit narrow. I did not use Tyvek on this album because it's very lightweight and small, and I just didn't think it needed it. But I've gone ahead and put the adhesive on the back in horizontal direction opposite the direction of the gussets in the spine. So I'm going to go ahead and attach this to the album and then I will be right back. So just as we did on the previous album, we're going to cut a piece of paper to the height of the album, which in this case is 4 inches, and then about 1 5/8 inches wide. We don't want it to go over those corners of the album, so just make sure that you measure the width of your spine. Once you've cut your paper to fit, then you're going to score it across the width of the paper, just as we did on the previous album, every 1/8 of an inch or on every groove of the scoreboard. And then we're going to cover it with fabric just as you see here, and that will be the spine of our album. So I'll pause here so that you can score your paper. So I'm going to wrap this piece of paper with a piece of fabric that is 1/4 of an inch larger all the way around. And so I'm just going to glue that on with this Crafter's Pick Ultimate Glue. And I'm going to glue the curved side, or when I rounded my paper after I scored it, so the side that made the inner part of the U, that is the side that I'm going to attach to the wrong side of the fabric. So I've got my fabric there with the right side of the fabric down and the wrong side, or the bad side of the fabric, up. And then I'm going to put that inner part of the curved paper down there. And then you're going to see me start to fold the corners of the fabric down. That is what I did with the Alice in Wonderland album. I folded the corners first and then the sides. That didn't work so well with this particular piece of paper and fabric. It was a bit thinner of paper and a bit thinner of fabric. And so I did not get a straight edge there on the corners. You can see I'm pointing out that we really need that straight square edge on the corners. And I thought that's what would do it on this, but I was wrong. It did not work. And so you're going to see me actually do all that. And then when I realize it's not going to work, I'm going to lift them all up and fold each side one at a time. So, um, and so what you're seeing me do now, do not do that. Do not fold your corners in first. Go ahead and fold each side one at a time. And then you're going to have a lot of bulk on the corners. So go ahead and trim that bulk off. This side will not be seen. It's going to be glued to the other piece of fabric. And so I'm going to go ahead and fast forward to that point. And so you're going to watch me fold everything over and then pull it apart and do it again and trim down those corner pieces. So there's that, okay? So this side is going to be glued against your spine, and then this side is just covering up the inner part of the spine, okay? So now on the second piece of fabric, I'm going to cut a piece that is around 6.5 inches tall and 3.5 to 4 inches wide. I want enough fabric on the sides there to wrap around my album. And then I'm going to fold the top and the bottom over about 1/4 of an inch so that it is the same height as that inner spine piece. And so once I've done that, then I'm going to go ahead and glue that inner spine piece to the center of this fabric. And I'm not measuring that, I'm just eyeballing it. It doesn't matter if it is exact, as long as we have enough fabric to wrap around the sides. And once we glue it onto the album, we just make sure that that inner spine piece is lined up correctly on the album. So I'm just making sure that everything's glued down and that it's secure, and then I'm going to go ahead and fit that over my album and make sure that everything is lined up and fits correctly before I glue it on. So I'm just folding the fabric down there just to give it a little fold. And so now I'm lining it up on the album and everything looks like it's going to fit. The fabric is just a little bit taller than the album, but I'm not going to worry about that. So here's where you want to make sure that your orientation is right, that if you want to poke a hole for your dangles, you need to do that now onto your fabric. Um, if you have chosen to do a Tim Holtz fastener or a brad type of a thing, you might want to put that poke a hole on the outer fabric and enclose the prongs of the brad in between the two pieces of fabric. Um, but if you're just poking a hole and putting an eyelet in, you can do that before you glue that onto the album. I am not going to be poking a hole for the spine, and instead I'm going to have just a piece of ribbon tied around the back of the spine. So I've decided there's too much bulk there on the edges of the page, and so I'm just going to angle that fabric a little bit, and I'm going to go 1/8 of an inch away from my spine. And in hindsight, I wish I had gone a little bit farther because I had already decorated my cover pieces, and when I put them on, I realized one piece was a little bit off, and so I have a little corner of raw fabric showing there against the spine. So the moral of the story is to make sure you've cut your cover pieces and not decorated them yet, and just make sure everything lines up and fits before you cut anything or glue it. So I'm just checking again on the side, and then I'm going to go ahead and glue one side of the fabric and then the other, pretty much in the same way that I did the previous album. So I'm going to go ahead and fast forward until we get to that point. Once you have the spine on your album, you are ready to decide whether or not you would like to have any kind of ribbon closure or any other type of ribbon that needs to wrap around your album underneath the covers. I forgot to do that, and I was going to tie a bow onto the back of the spine like I did the Alice in Wonderland album. So I ended up ripping the covers off later and doing that, but I really don't recommend that. So anyway, I am gluing my covers on, and my book is 4 by 4, but I ended up trimming the width down to just a 1/16 of an inch less. So I'm flipping that over to the correct side. But you're going to need that little bit of extra space towards the back of the album so that you can open your book properly. The cover is 1/16 of an inch thick, so if you don't have that little bit of extra space, it could dig into that spine and your book won't open properly. So I've made sure that I have enough space there for my book to open, and so I'm going to go ahead and glue the covers onto the spine. Once I had discovered that I had forgotten to tie the ribbon on the back of the album, I decided to demonstrate that here. And basically, you're going to attach the ribbon onto the album just as you did the ribbon closure that I demonstrated earlier in the tutorial. I'm just placing the bulk of the ribbon towards the back instead of the front. So I'm just going to tie it in a bow, and that is how you put the ribbon on. And then after that, you'll just place your covers or your covers onto the album. And then when you tie the bow, you can tie your charms into the knot there, or you can do what I did on this Alice in Wonderland album, and I placed the charms onto a large pin, and then I've just pinned it there into the center of the knot. So that concludes the tutorial. And if you would like to see both of these completed projects, make sure that you hit the subscription box below and the little notification bell so that you will see when I post the videos. And also, I will have a link in the description box below to the videos for the Alice in Wonderland album and the Autumn album. So thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.